The vast Atlantic Ocean churned with gray waves under a leaden sky on August 19th in the year 1812. Captain Isaac Hull stood on the quarterdeck of the USS Constitution and peered through his spyglass at a distant sail. The silhouette was unmistakable to his trained eye as a British frigate of the Royal Navy. Tension tightened the chests of the 450 men aboard the American ship as the drums beat to quarters. This was not merely a chance encounter on the high seas, but a moment of destiny for a young nation. The British ship was the HMS Guerriere, and her captain James Dacres was eager to punish the insolent rebels. Smoke billowed from the 18-pounder guns as the two warships closed the distance. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning powder and the deafening roar of cannon fire. Iron balls smashed against the thick oak hull of the Constitution, but many bounced off harmlessly into the sea. An American sailor watched in awe as the British shot failed to penetrate the live oak planks and shouted that her sides were made of iron. This legendary moment christened the ship Old Ironsides. The American gun crews waited with disciplined patience until the ships were within pistol-shot range to unleash a devastating broadside that would shatter the British masts. The stakes for the United States could not have been higher during this precarious summer. The Royal Navy possessed over 600 ships and ruled the global oceans with an iron fist. Britain had spent decades fighting the fleets of France and Spain and had emerged as the undisputed master of the sea. In contrast, the United States Navy was a tiny force with fewer than 20 seaworthy warships. Most European observers expected the British to sweep the American frigates from the ocean in a matter of months. A defeat here would not just mean the loss of a ship, but the humiliation of the American Republic on the world stage. British captains had grown accustomed to absolute dominance and often impressed American sailors into service against their will. This practice of impressment was a primary cause of the conflict and a source of deep national anger in America. The Royal Navy believed their ships were invincible and their crews superior to any other force. They viewed the Americans as upstarts who possessed oversized frigates that were ungentlemanly in their design. However, the British underestimation of American engineering and gunnery skill would prove to be a fatal error. The war was about to challenge the very foundation of British naval supremacy. The protagonist of this early naval drama was the American heavy frigate itself. Designed by the visionary architect Joshua Humphreys, these ships were unique beasts of war. They were longer and wider than standard British frigates and carried more guns. The hull construction utilized dense live oak from Georgia, which was incredibly resistant to rot and cannon fire. Humphreys intended these ships to be fast enough to escape a ship of the line, but strong enough to crush any frigate of equal class. The USS Constitution and her sisters were the secret weapon that the British Admiralty had failed to appreciate until it was too late. Captain Isaac Hull was the man charged with proving the worth of these super frigates. He was a portly and amiable man, but possessed a brilliant tactical mind. Hull had spent weeks drilling his crew to perfection, ensuring they could fire their guns faster and more accurately than their opponents. He understood that in a single ship duel, the quality of the crew mattered just as much as the strength of the vessel. As the Constitution maneuvered against the Guerriere, Hull held his fire until the ships were side by side. His patience allowed the American broadside to tear through the British hull and topple her masts in a catastrophic display of power. The question that haunted the British Admiralty was how a ragtag navy could defeat one of their finest frigates. When news of the victory reached London, it was met with disbelief and shock. The Times of London lamented that never before had an English ship struck her colors to an American vessel. For the Americans, the victory was a delirious cause for celebration. It proved that the Royal Navy could be beaten. But was this merely a fluke, or was it the beginning of a new era in naval warfare? The ocean remained filled with British squadrons hunting for American ships. Stephen Decatur was another American captain, eager to test his mettle against the mistress of the seas. Commanding the USS United States, he patrolled the waters near the Canary Islands in October 1812. Decatur was a dashing figure known for his daring exploits in the Barbary Wars. He spotted the HMS Macedonian, a British frigate renowned for her speed and commanded by Captain John Carden. Carden believed his ship was superior and engaged Decatur with confidence. However, the USS United States carried 24-pounder guns that outranged the 18-pounders of the Macedonian, allowing Decatur to hammer the British from a distance. The battle between the United States and the Macedonian demonstrated the superior long-range gunnery of the Americans. Decatur maneuvered his ship to cross the bow of the enemy and rake her decks with terrible effect. The British crew fought bravely, but they were dismantled systematically by the heavy American shot. The mizzen mast of the Macedonian fell, and her hull was riddled with holes. Captain Carden was forced to surrender his ship to the man he had once dined with in peacetime. It was the first time a British frigate had been brought into an American harbor as a prize of war. William Bainbridge succeeded Hull in command of the Constitution and sought to replicate the success of his predecessor. Sailing off the coast of Brazil in December 1812, he encountered the HMS Java. The Java was a fast frigate carrying the new governor of Bombay and a large crew. The battle that ensued was a furious close-range brawl. Bainbridge was wounded twice during the engagement, but refused to leave the quarterdeck. He steered his ship with the wheel shattered, relying on a chain system below decks. The Constitution once again proved her resilience, absorbing punishment while dismasting the Java completely. The loss of 3 frigates in rapid succession sent shockwaves through the British Empire. The Admiralty issued secret orders forbidding British captains from engaging American heavy frigates in single combat unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. This was a tacit admission that the American ships were superior in a one-on-one fight. The psychological impact was immense. The aura of British invincibility had been pierced. In the United States, the victories provided a crucial morale boost for a war that was going poorly on land. The Navy became the darling of the American public. However, the tide of war is rarely constant, and arrogance can lead to ruin. In June 1813, Captain James Lawrence commanded the USS Chesapeake in Boston Harbor. The British frigate HMS Shannon, commanded by Philip Broke, was blockading the port. Broke was a master gunner who had drilled his crew relentlessly for years. He sent a challenge to Lawrence, inviting him to come out and fight. Lawrence accepted despite having a raw and inexperienced crew. He sailed out of the harbor with flags flying, expecting another easy American victory. The citizens of Boston watched from the hills, anticipating a spectacle. The battle between the Chesapeake and the Shannon was short and brutal. Captain Broke had trained his men to fire with deadly precision at the enemy personnel. As the ships collided, the British Marines swept the American deck with musket fire. Captain Lawrence was mortally wounded by a sniper bullet. As he was carried below decks, he uttered the immortal words, "Do not give up the ship." Despite his play, the British boarders overwhelmed the American crew in a bloody hand-to-hand struggle. The Chesapeake was captured in less than 15 minutes, marking the end of the American winning streak. The capture of the Chesapeake was a harsh lesson for the young Navy. It highlighted the importance of crew discipline and the danger of overconfidence. The British celebrated the victory with immense relief, proving to themselves that they could still win at sea. However, the dying command of James Lawrence became a rallying cry for the rest of the war. His words were stitched onto battle flags and shouted by sailors in subsequent engagements. The war at sea settled into a grinding blockade as the Royal Navy tightened its grip on the American coast, effectively bottling up the heavy frigates. With the Atlantic coast blockaded, the focus of the naval war shifted to the interior lakes. Control of the Great Lakes was essential for the movement of armies and supplies on the northern frontier. Lake Erie and Lake Champlain became the new battlegrounds where carpenters and shipwrights raced to build fleets from the wilderness. The logistics were a nightmare, as every cannon and coil of rope had to be hauled overland through dense forests. The side that could build ships faster would likely control the vast freshwater seas and determine the fate of the Northwest Territory. Oliver Hazard Perry arrived at Presque Isle on Lake Erie to find a desperate situation. The American squadron consisted of a few converted merchant vessels and unfinished hulls. Perry was a young and energetic officer who worked tirelessly to oversee construction. He battled sickness and supply shortages, while the British squadron under Commander Robert Harriet Barclay blockaded the harbor. Perry managed to float his new brigs over the sandbar at the harbor entrance by removing their guns to lighten the load. It was a risky maneuver performed right under the noses of the British. On September 10, 1813, the two squadrons met in the Battle of Lake Erie. Perry commanded from his flagship, the USS Lawrence, which he had named in honor of his fallen friend. He hoisted a blue battle flag emblazoned with the words, "Do not give up the ship." The wind was light, which made maneuvering difficult. Perry made the bold decision to close with the British, immediately exposing his ship to long-range fire. The Lawrence took a terrible beating from the British guns as Perry tried to bring his carronades to bear. The carnage aboard the Lawrence was horrific. The British concentrated their fire on Perry's flagship, reducing it to a floating wreck. Most of the crew was killed or wounded, and the guns were silenced one by one. Yet Perry refused to surrender. In a moment of extraordinary courage, he ordered a small rowboat to be lowered. He grabbed his battle flag and transferred his command to the USS Niagara, which had remained relatively unengaged. He rode through a hail of musket and cannon fire miraculously, arriving unharmed aboard the fresh ship. Once aboard the Niagara, Perry took command and steered the vessel directly into the British line. He unleashed a double broadside that raked the exhausted British ships from both sides. The British squadron, which had been on the verge of victory, was suddenly thrown into chaos. Their ships collided and their commanders were wounded. Within 15 minutes of Perry's arrival on the Niagara, the entire British squadron surrendered. It was the first time in history that an entire British naval squadron had been captured intact. Perry scribbled a message to General William Henry Harrison on the back of an old envelope. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." The victory on Lake Erie was a strategic turning point. It secured American control of the lake and forced the British to abandon Detroit. The American army was able to retake the Northwest Territory and smash the British and their native allies at the Battle of the Thames. Perry became a national hero equal in stature to Hull and Decatur. The Great Lakes remained in American hands for the duration of the war. The final critical naval showdown took place a year later on Lake Champlain. In September 1814, a massive British army marched south from Canada, intending to invade New York. They were supported by a naval squadron that needed to control the lake to supply the invasion force. Standing in their way was Master Commandant Thomas Macdonough and a hastily built American fleet. Macdonough was a devout and meticulous officer who prepared his defense with great care. He chose to anchor his ships in Plattsburgh Bay, forcing the British to attack him on his terms. Macdonough arranged his ships in a line across the bay entrance, ensuring the British would have to approach head-on under heavy fire. He also employed a clever system of spring lines attached to his anchors. These ropes allowed him to rotate his ship while at anchor, bringing fresh guns to bear without using sails. This tactical innovation would prove decisive in the coming battle. The British commander George Downey was confident in the superior firepower of his flagship, the HMS Confiance, but he underestimated the defensive advantage of the American position. The Battle of Plattsburgh Bay began on the morning of September 11, 1814. The British flagship unleashed a devastating broadside that shook Macdonough's flagship, the USS Saratoga. The battle raged for hours, with both sides hammering each other at close range. The smoke was so thick that gunners could barely see their targets. Commander Downey was killed early in the fight by a cannon that was knocked from its carriage. The British ships fought fiercely, but the American line held firm against the onslaught. As the battle wore on, the starboard batteries of both flagships were completely disabled. It was then that Macdonough utilized his spring lines. He spun the Saratoga around 180 degrees, presenting a fresh broadside to the enemy. The British tried to replicate the maneuver, but their ship stalled in the wind. The Saratoga raked the helpless Confiance until she was forced to strike her colors. With their flagship lost, the remaining British vessels surrendered or fled. The invasion force, which had been watching from the shore, realized their supply line was gone. The British Army retreated back to Canada, abandoning their invasion plans. Macdonough's victory on Lake Champlain was arguably the most strategically significant naval battle of the war. It prevented a major British occupation of northern New York and strengthened the American position at the peace negotiations in Ghent. The war had reached a stalemate. The British had burned Washington but failed to capture Baltimore or New York. The Americans had failed to conquer Canada but had defended their borders and won stunning victories at sea. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December 1814, effectively ending the war. The maritime grievances that started the conflict were not explicitly resolved in the text, but the geopolitical landscape had changed. The Royal Navy no longer impressed American sailors, as the Napoleonic Wars had ended. The United States had proved that it was not a pushover. The young republic had stood toe-to-toe with the greatest naval power on Earth and held its own. The heavy frigates and the lake squadrons had earned the respect of the world. The legacy of the War of 1812 naval battles is woven into the DNA of the United States Navy. The names of the ships and their captains are still revered today. The USS Constitution remains a commissioned warship, a floating symbol of American resilience. The slogans "Do not give up the ship" and "We have met the enemy, and they are ours" became timeless mottos of determination and victory. The war established a tradition of excellence in gunnery and seamanship that would define the American naval service for centuries. The conflict also shattered the myth of European superiority. It demonstrated that a republic could build and operate a professional navy capable of defeating an imperial power. The frigates designed by Joshua Humphreys proved that innovation and quality could overcome numerical disadvantage. The live oak hulls and heavy guns were technological marvels of their time. The victories boosted American nationalism and helped forge a unified identity for a country that was still a collection of disparate states. While the land war was often marked by incompetence and failure, the naval war was a source of immense pride. The sailors who fought on the Constitution, the United States, and the Lake Squadrons were hailed as the saviors of the nation. They had defended the honor of the flag when it was most threatened. The British Admiralty was forced to reassess its tactics and ship designs, acknowledging the American influence. The era of the super frigate had arrived, changing naval architecture forever. Ultimately, the Naval War of 1812 was a coming-of-age story for the United States. It was the moment when the young eagle challenged the old lion and survived. The battles were fought with a ferocity and chivalry that seems distant to the modern mind. Captains often treated their prisoners with great respect, sharing dinners and cabins after the violence had ended. Yet the combat itself was visceral and terrifying, a test of iron and wood and human will. The image of the USS Constitution escaping a British squadron in a calm by kedging her anchors for days remains a testament to American ingenuity. The sight of Perry transferring his flag in a rowboat amidst a storm of iron remains a testament to American courage. These stories are not just military history, but foundational myths of the American experience. They remind us that even against overwhelming odds, skill and determination can alter the course of history. As we look back at these events, we see the birth of a global power. The United States would go on to build a navy that would eventually eclipse the Royal Navy in size and strength. But it started here with a handful of frigates and a few thousand sailors who refused to accept the dominance of an empire. The Atlantic and the Great Lakes served as the crucible where the American spirit was tested and tempered. The roar of those cannons still echoes in the annals of history. The war ended without any exchange of territory, but the psychological victory was absolute. America had asserted its sovereignty and its right to sail the free seas. The Star-Spangled Banner, written during the bombardment of Fort McHenry, captures the resilience that defined the era. But it was the wooden walls of the Navy that kept the enemy at bay. The sacrifices made on the blood-stained decks of the Lawrence and the Chesapeake ensured that the Republic would endure. In the end, the War of 1812 secured the independence that had been declared in 1776. It was the Second War of Independence fought not just for land, but for respect. The naval battles were the highlights of this struggle, providing the heroes and the moments that would inspire future generations. The United States Navy had challenged the British dominance, and in doing so had carved out its own place in the sun. The silence returned to the waters of the Atlantic and the lakes after the peace was signed. The wrecks of the ships rotted on the lake bottoms or were broken up for scrap. But the memory of the conflict remained vivid. The Royal Navy would never again underestimate the Americans. The two nations would eventually become the closest of allies, patrolling the oceans together in the centuries to come. But that friendship was forged in the fires of 1812. Today, the USS Constitution sits in Boston Harbor as a living connection to that past. She is more than a museum piece. She is a veteran of the war that defined a navy. Her wooden planks vibrated with the roar of the guns that humbled the Guerriere and the Java. To walk her decks is to step back into a time when the fate of the nation rested on the wind and the waves. She is a silent witness to the bravery of the men who sailed her. The story of these naval battles is a reminder that history is made by individuals who rise to the occasion. It is a story of carpenters who built ships in the winter snow and sailors who stood fast when the splinters flew. It is the story of America's young Navy challenging the impossible and succeeding. The whisper of time carries their voices to us, speaking of duty, honor, and country. As the sun sets on the narrative of the War of 1812, we are left with the enduring image of the stars and stripes flying over the open ocean. It is a symbol that was defended with iron and blood. The young Navy had grown up in the hard school of war. The dominance of the British had been challenged, and the world had taken notice. The seas were no longer the sole property of any one king.